The heavy oak doors of courtroom 7B swung open with a groan that echoed through the cavernous space, and 8-year-old Emma felt her stomach drop to her feet. She'd been in big rooms before, school gymnasiums, church halls, even the emergency room, but nothing compared to this. The ceilings seemed to stretch up forever, decorated with ornate moldings that looked like they were frowning down at her. Rows of wooden benches filled with strangers turned to stare as she entered, their faces a blur of curiosity and pity that made her skin crawl. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm right here with you," whispered Sarah, Emma's foster mother, squeezing her small hand gently. But Sarah couldn't go past the wooden gate that separated the gallery from the area where all the important people sat. Emma would have to walk the rest of the way alone. Well, not entirely alone. Beside her, his tail wagging with calm confidence that Emma desperately wished she could borrow, walked Buddy. The golden retriever had been Emma's constant companion for the past 6 months, ever since Child Protective Services had placed her in Sarah's home. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was a certified therapy dog, specifically trained to help children dealing with trauma and PTSD. His warm brown eyes looked up at Emma as if to say, "I've got you. We can do this together." The prosecutor, a tall woman named Ms. Jennifer with kind eyes and a navy blue suit, smiled encouragingly at Emma. "You're doing great," she mouthed silently. But Emma didn't feel great. She felt like she might throw up the scrambled eggs Sarah had made her eat for breakfast, even though she'd barely touched them. The bailiff, a large man with a serious face, led Emma to the witness stand, a wooden chair positioned on a raised platform that made her feel like she was on display in a zoo. Someone had thoughtfully placed a booster cushion on the seat so she could reach the microphone, which only made Emma feel smaller and more childlike. She climbed up carefully, her legs shaking so badly she almost tripped on the step. Buddy followed, settling himself on the floor right beside her chair, close enough that she could feel his warmth against her leg. "Please state your name for the record," the court reporter said in a bored voice, her fingers poised over a strange-looking keyboard. Emma's mouth had gone completely dry. She tried to swallow, but it felt like her throat was full of sand. "Emma," she whispered. "A little louder, please, honey," Judge said from the bench. The judge was an African-American woman in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation for being firm but fair, and she'd been on the bench for nearly 30 years. She'd seen countless cases involving children, but something about this particular case had troubled her from the moment she'd read the file. The details of what these foster children had endured made her blood boil. "Emma," Emma said again, her voice only slightly louder. Her hands gripped the wooden armrest of the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned completely white. Under the chair, her feet dangled, not quite reaching the floor, making her feel even more powerless and small. From across the courtroom, Emma could feel eyes boring into her. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Her gaze drifted toward the defendant's table, and there he was. Her former foster father sat in an expensive-looking suit that was probably meant to make him look respectable and trustworthy. His lawyer had probably told him to dress that way, but Emma knew the truth. She knew what lay beneath that pressed shirt and polite expression. Was 43 years old with thinning brown hair and an average build, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd, who could smile at neighbors and fool social workers. That's what made him so dangerous. He looked normal. He looked safe. But his eyes were the same as they'd always been, cold, calculating, mean. When their gazes met, his mouth curved into the slightest smirk, so subtle that probably no one else in the courtroom noticed it. But Emma saw it. And suddenly, she wasn't sitting in a witness chair in a Michigan courthouse anymore. She was back in that house, back in that dark bedroom with the lock on the outside of the door, back to feeling helpless and terrified and small. Buddy sensed the change immediately. The golden retriever shifted his position, pressing more firmly against Emma's leg, providing that grounding pressure that helped remind her where she really was. His wet nose nudged her dangling hand, and Emma's fingers instinctively buried themselves in his soft, warm fur. The sensation helped anchor her to the present moment. "Emma," Ms. began gently, stepping closer to the witness stand but careful not to crowd the frightened child. "I know this is very difficult, but you're very brave for being here today. Can you tell the court how old you are?" "8," Emma answered, her voice small but steady. "I'll be 9 in December." "And do you know why you're here today?" Emma nodded, then remembered she had to speak out loud. "Yes, to tell about Mr." The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, everyone waiting for what would come next. In the gallery, Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her heart breaking for the little girl she'd come to love as her own daughter. Beside her sat Emma's therapist, Dr. Rachel Foster, a specialist in childhood trauma who had been working with Emma twice a week since her placement in Sarah's home. Dr. Foster had strongly advised against Emma testifying. "She's not ready," she'd told the prosecutor during a pretrial meeting. "Facing her abuser could re-traumatize her significantly. We've made so much progress over these past 6 months. I'm worried this could set her back months or even years." But Emma had insisted. When Ms. had explained that Emma didn't have to testify if she didn't want to, that there were other witnesses and evidence, Emma had shaken her head firmly. "The other kids are scared," she'd said, referring to the 3 other foster children who'd lived in his house. "They need to see that it's okay to tell. Someone has to go first." That courage had impressed everyone who heard it. But now, sitting in the actual courtroom with all those eyes on her, and his presence filling the space like poison gas, Emma wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. "Emma, I want you to tell the court about the time you spent living in Mr.'s home," Ms. said, her voice calm and encouraging. "Let's start with when you first arrived. Do you remember what month that was?" Emma nodded slowly, her fingers continuing to stroke Buddy's soft ears. The repetitive motion helped calm her racing heart. "It was February 2 years ago, right after my 7th birthday. The social worker said. She said it would be a good home. She said Mr. was an experienced foster parent who'd helped lots of kids." A bitter laugh almost escaped Emma's throat, but she swallowed it down. Experienced. Yes, had been fostering children for almost a decade. Good home, that was the lie of all. "And what was it like when you first moved in?" Ms. asked. Emma's mind drifted back to that first day, pulling up the winter afternoon when she'd arrived with nothing but a garbage bag full of her belongings, the standard luggage for kids in the system. "At first it seemed okay," she admitted, and she saw his lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. nod as if this proved something. "He showed me my room. There were 3 other kids there, Tyler, Madison, and Little. He made spaghetti for dinner that first night." "So it started out all right," Ms. prompted. "For about 2 weeks," Emma said, and now her voice dropped lower. "Then things changed. That's when the rules started." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the court reporter had paused her typing, caught up in the story despite having heard countless testimonies over the years. Emma took a shaky breath, feeling Buddy's steady presence beside her like an anchor in a storm. Judge watched the child carefully from the bench, her experienced eyes noting every sign of distress, the trembling hands, the rapid breathing, the way Emma's eyes kept darting toward the defendant's table. Had presided over hundreds of cases involving children, from custody disputes to abuse cases, but something about Emma struck her as particularly fragile. The judge made a mental note to watch carefully and to call a recess at the first sign that the child was becoming overwhelmed. What judge couldn't have known, what no one in that courtroom could have anticipated, was that within minutes, this routine testimony would turn into something unprecedented, something that would make headlines across the nation and change the way courts handled traumatized child witnesses forever. All because of a little girl's silent signal and her faithful dog's extraordinary response. Retriams took a small step closer to the witness stand, her voice remaining soft and measured. She'd prosecuted child abuse cases for 15 years, and she knew that the key was to go slowly, to let the child set the pace. Rushing would only cause the witness to shut down completely. Emma, you mentioned that the rules started after about 2 weeks. Can you tell the court what kind of rules you're talking about? Emma's fingers tightened in Buddy's fur, and the golden retriever responded by shifting even closer, his warmth a comforting presence against her leg. She could do this. She had to do this. Tyler, Madison, and were counting on her. They'd all promised each other that if they ever got the chance to tell the truth, they would. No more hiding. No more protecting the monster. The food rules came first, Emma began, her voice wavering but growing slightly stronger as she spoke. Mr. said we were eating too much, costing him too much money. He started locking the kitchen at night. He put a padlock on the refrigerator and the pantry cabinets. We could only eat at specific times, breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. If you missed a meal, you didn't eat until the next one. Several jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman in the back row crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her face darkening with anger. In the gallery, Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out. When Emma had first come to live with her, the child had weighed 20 pounds less than she should have for her age and height. Sarah had spent months carefully helping Emma rebuild a healthy relationship with food, teaching her that it was okay to eat when she was hungry, that meals wouldn't be taken away as punishment. Did this happen to all the children in the home? Ms. asked, keeping her voice neutral despite the rage building in her chest. Yes, ma'am, Emma replied, remembering the etiquette Dr. Foster had coached her on. Being polite helped her feel more in control. All 4 of us. Tyler was 12, Madison was 10, was only 5. Cried a lot because she didn't understand why she couldn't have snacks like she used to. What happened when cried? Ms. asked, though she already knew the answer from the previous interviews. The jury needed to hear it directly from Emma. Emma's face paled and her breathing quickened. This was one of the hard parts. Mr. would get really angry. He'd yell that she was ungrateful, that he was doing her a favor by even letting her live there. Then he'd send her to her room and lock the door from the outside. A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Mr., the defense attorney, remained stone-faced, his pen moving steadily across his legal pad. He'd known this testimony was coming, had prepared his client for it, but hearing it spoken aloud by a trembling 8-year-old made it much more damaging than words in a police report. The doors locked from the outside, Ms. repeated, making sure the jury caught this crucial detail. Yes, ma'am, all our bedroom doors did. Mr. installed special locks after I'd been there for about a month. He said it was to keep us safe, but Emma's voice trailed off and she looked down at Buddy, drawing strength from his steady presence. But really it was to keep us trapped. He'd lock us in for hours, sometimes all day, sometimes overnight. Judge's jaw tightened. She'd read this in the case file, but hearing it spoken aloud made it somehow more real, more horrifying. She glanced at who sat at the defendant's table with an expression of wounded innocence, as if he couldn't believe he was being so wrongly accused. It was an act she'd seen 100 times before, the mask of the abuser, carefully crafted to hide the truth. Emma, I need you to be very specific now, Ms. said gently. When you say he would lock you in your rooms, how long would this typically last? Emma closed her eyes, remembering. The memories came flooding back in vivid detail, the feeling of panic as she'd hear the click of the lock, the desperate need to use the bathroom, the hunger pangs that would grow from uncomfortable to agonizing, the sound of her own voice growing hoarse from calling out for someone to let her out. It depended on what we did wrong, she said quietly. If you talked back or didn't finish your chores fast enough, maybe 3 or 4 hours. If you did something worse. What would be considered worse? Ms. prompted. Taking extra food, trying to call someone on the phone, telling a teacher at school that something was wrong. Emma's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Those could get you locked up for a whole day, sometimes 2 days. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge banged her gavel once firmly. Order, she commanded, and the whispers immediately ceased. but the shock and horror on people's faces remained visible. "Emma, when you were locked in your room for these extended periods, did Mr. provide you with food, water, access to a bathroom?" Ms. asked, though again, she knew the answers. The jury needed to hear every terrible detail. Tears began streaming down Emma's face now, but her voice remained steady. She was determined to get through this. Sometimes he'd bring a glass of water after the first day, but no food. And no, we couldn't use the bathroom. We had to. We had to just go in a corner and try to clean it up later. Madison got a really bad infection once because of that. She was crying and saying it hurt to pee, but Mr. said she was faking to get attention. Sarah couldn't hold back anymore. A sob escaped her throat, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely. The bailiff glanced at her but made no move to remove her from the courtroom. Judge had seen and heard enough emotional reactions over the years to know the difference between a disruption and a mother's heartbreak. Ms. handed Emma a tissue, giving her a moment to compose herself. "You're doing so well, Emma. I know this is incredibly difficult. Can you tell the court about the other children, Tyler, Madison, and did they experience the same treatment?" Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with the tissue while her other hand remained buried in Buddy's fur. "Yes, we all did. Tyler got it the worst because he was the oldest and he tried to protect us. One time he told Mr. that locking up wasn't fair because she was just a little kid. Mr. locked Tyler in his room for 3 days straight. When he finally let him out, Tyler was so weak he could barely walk. We helped him to the bathroom and he almost passed out." Several jury members were now visibly upset. One older gentleman in the front row had removed his glasses and was rubbing his eyes. A younger woman in the second row had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. This was exactly what Ms. had hoped for, not that she took any pleasure in Emma's pain, but the jury needed to understand the full scope of cruelty. "Did any adults know what was happening?" Ms. asked. "Did you try to tell anyone?" This question made Emma's face flush with shame, an emotion Dr. Foster had worked hard to help her understand she shouldn't feel. "We tried," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "Madison told a school counselor once that things were hard at home. The counselor called Mr., and he came to the school all friendly and concerned. He said Madison was having trouble adjusting, that he was working with her, that she tended to exaggerate for attention. The counselor believed him." "What happened to Madison after that?" Ms. asked. Emma's voice dropped to barely audible. "He locked her in her room for a week, a whole week. He said she'd betrayed his trust and needed to think about what she'd done. When he finally let her out, she was so scared and hungry that she—" Emma paused, struggling with the memory. "She promised him she'd never tell anyone anything ever again." The courtroom was deathly silent. Even Mr. had stopped writing, his face carefully neutral but his knuckles white where he gripped his pen. Sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, but a slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his anger at hearing these secrets exposed to the world. "Emma," Ms. continued, her voice gentle but firm, "I need to ask you about the physical aspects of your treatment. Did Mr. ever strike you or the other children?" Emma hesitated. This was complicated territory and she knew it. "Not with his fists," she said carefully. "He was too smart for that. He knew that would leave bruises people could see, but he had other ways." "What other ways?" "He'd grab us really hard, by the arm or the shoulder, hard enough to leave marks but only where clothes would cover them. He'd push us into walls. Once he pulled Madison's hair so hard that a chunk came out. He twisted Tyler's arm behind his back until Tyler was crying and begging him to stop." Emma's breathing was becoming faster now, the memories crowding in on her. "And he'd get really close to our faces when he was angry, screaming at us. Spit would fly from his mouth. He'd call us worthless, stupid, ungrateful little parasites who should be thankful he didn't just throw us out on the street." Buddy sensed Emma's rising distress and let out a soft whine, pressing his body more firmly against her leg. The pressure helped, grounding her in the present moment, reminding her that she was safe now, that couldn't hurt her anymore. "Did these incidents happen frequently?" Ms. asked. All the time, Emma replied. Every day there was something. If the house wasn't clean enough, if we were too loud, if we looked at him wrong, he'd find reasons. It was like he enjoyed having power over us. Like we weren't real people to him, just things he could control. Ms. nodded slowly, letting Emma's words sink in for the jury. And the community, the neighbors, did anyone suspect what was happening? Emma shook her head. Mr. was really good at pretending. When social workers came for their visits, he'd always know ahead of time. He'd make sure we were all clean and the house was perfect. He'd buy special food and cook a nice meal. He'd put on this whole act, being all kind and patient. He'd tell us exactly what to say and what would happen if we didn't say it. What would happen? Ms. asked. He said if we told the truth, they'd split us up and send us to different homes. He said we'd never see each other again. He said some of us might end up in group homes where things were even worse. And he said, Emma's voice cracked. He said nobody would believe us anyway, that he'd been doing this for years and no one ever believed the kids. He said we were damaged goods and that's why our real parents didn't want us, so why would anyone believe us over him? The cruelty of this psychological manipulation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Sarah was sobbing openly now, and she wasn't alone. Even Judge had to take a moment, removing her glasses and pinching the bridge of her nose. Emma looked up at Ms., tears streaming down her face but her voice stronger than it had been at the start. But he was wrong. You believed us. Sarah believes us. Dr. Foster believes us. And that's why I'm here, because someone has to tell the truth. The courtroom seemed to collectively exhale, and in that moment, Emma, 8 years old and barely 4 feet tall, seemed to grow larger, her courage filling the space around her. Ms. gave Emma a moment to collect herself, watching as the child took several deep breaths and buried her face briefly in Buddy's soft golden fur. The prosecutor knew they were approaching the most difficult part of the testimony, the incident that had finally brought House of Horrors crashing down. She glanced at her notes, then back at Emma's tear-stained face, and made a decision to proceed as gently as possible. Emma, I know you've been incredibly brave so far, Ms. said, her voice dropping to an even softer tone. But I need to ask you about a specific night. The night of March 15th. Do you remember that night? The change in Emma was immediate and dramatic. Her entire body went rigid, her spine straightening as if she'd been shocked with electricity. The hand that had been stroking Buddy's ears froze mid-motion. Her eyes, which had been focused on Ms., suddenly seemed to stare at something far away, something only she could see. The color drained from her face so completely that Sarah half rose from her seat in alarm. Emma, Ms. asked, concern creeping into her professional demeanor, can you hear me? But Emma was no longer in the courtroom. In her mind, she had been transported back 7 months, back to that terrible night that had changed everything. She could smell it, the musty odor of the small closet under the stairs where had shoved her. She could feel it, the rough wooden walls pressing against her shoulders in the cramped space, the hard floor beneath her, the darkness so complete it felt like a living thing trying to swallow her whole. Dr. Foster leaned forward in her seat, her trained eye immediately recognizing the signs of a dissociative episode. Emma was having a flashback, her mind protecting itself by retreating from the present moment. The therapist had warned Ms. this might happen, had spent hours preparing Emma for the possibility, but knowing it might happen and watching it actually occur were two very different things. Your Honor, Dr. Foster said, rising from her seat, I think we need to. But Judge was already paying close attention, her hand raised to pause the proceedings. She'd seen witnesses experience trauma responses before, though rarely in someone so young. Ms., approach the bench, please. Mr., you as well. As the two attorneys hurried to the judge's bench for a whispered conference, Emma remained frozen in the witness chair. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, her chest rising and falling in quick, panicked gasps. A fine tremor had started in her hands and was spreading through her entire body. Beads of sweat appeared on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the air-conditioned courtroom. Buddy, sensitive to every shift in Emma's emotional state, sat up. His ears perked forward, and he let out a soft, concerned whine. He nudged Emma's hand with his nose, trying to break through the wall of terror that had descended over her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality that the therapy dog had been trained to recognize as dangerous. At the bench, Judge spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Ms., that child is clearly in distress. I'm inclined to call a recess." "Your Honor, I understand, but this is the critical testimony," Ms. argued quietly. "This is the incident that led to the police involvement, the evidence collection, everything. Without her testimony about March 15th, our case becomes significantly weaker." Mr. seized the opportunity. "Your Honor, it's clear that the witness is not competent to continue. She's a traumatized child who's been coached to say certain things, and now when pressed for specifics, she's falling apart. I move to strike her testimony and dismiss." "Mister, I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a coached witness and a traumatized child reliving genuine horror," Judge cut him off sharply. "Your motion is, however, Ms., I am concerned about." A sound from the witness stand interrupted them, a small, choked whimper that was barely audible but somehow carried across the entire courtroom. Emma had begun to rock slightly in her chair, her arms wrapping around herself in a protective gesture. Her lips were moving, forming words that no one could hear. Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. "Emma, baby, it's okay. You're safe," she called out, her voice breaking. The bailiff looked at Judge uncertainly, but the judge made no move to silence Sarah. Sometimes the rules needed to bend in the face of a child suffering. But Emma didn't seem to hear Sarah's voice. In her mind, she was back in that closet and heavy footsteps were approaching. She could hear them, thud, 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 getting closer. She remembered how her heart had pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She remembered the door flying open, his face contorted with rage, his hand reaching for her. "No," Emma whispered, so quietly that only those closest to her could hear. "Please, no, I'm sorry, please don't." Her breathing was becoming dangerously rapid now, hyperventilation setting in. Tears streamed down her face, but she seemed unaware of them. Her whole body shook violently, and a keening sound emerged from her throat, the sound of pure, primal fear. Buddy stood up fully now, his professional training warring with his natural protective instincts. He could sense that Emma was in serious psychological distress, that she was drowning in memories too terrible for her young mind to process. The dog pressed against her leg more insistently, trying to anchor her to the present, but Emma's hand had fallen limp at her side, no longer seeking the comfort of his fur. At the defendant's table, watched the scene unfold with an expression that might have been concern to the casual observer. But if you looked closely, and Judge was looking very closely, you could see something else in his eyes. Satisfaction. He was pleased to see Emma breaking down, pleased to see her suffering. It was a look the judge had seen in abusers before, that subtle enjoyment of power and control. Ms. returned to the witness stand, her face etched with concern and guilt. She'd pushed too hard, asked the crucial question too quickly. "Emma, honey, you don't have to." But her words seemed to trigger something in Emma. The mention of that night, the feeling of being back in that closet, the terror of waiting for to return, it all came crashing together. Emma's eyes, which had been staring at nothing, suddenly snapped into focus. But she wasn't seeing the courtroom. She was seeing standing in front of her in that closet doorway, his face twisted with rage. And in that moment, Emma's gaze swung toward the defendant's table. The eye contact between the 8-year-old victim and her 43-year-old abuser lasted only a second, but it might as well have been an eternity. His cold, calculating eyes met Emma's terrified ones, and something passed between them. A recognition. A confirmation of the power dynamic that had defined their relationship for 2 years. Emma saw in his eyes the same look he'd had that night, the look that said he owned her, that she was nothing, that she was completely in his power. It was too much. The careful psychological preparation, the therapy sessions, the breathing exercises Dr. Foster had taught her, all of it crumbled in the face of that look. Emma tried to speak, tried to tell Ms. what had happened that night, tried to be brave like she'd promised the other kids she would be. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed completely, her body's protective mechanism shutting down her ability to verbalize the trauma. Her hands, which had been gripping the armrests, began to shake so violently that the tremors were visible from across the courtroom. Her breathing, already rapid, became even faster, short, gasping pants that weren't bringing enough oxygen to her brain. Dark spots began to appear in her vision. The courtroom seemed to tilt and spin around her. "Emma," Sarah's voice came from somewhere far away, distorted and strange. Dr. Foster was on her feet now, moving toward the gate that separated the gallery from the court proper. "She's having a panic attack. She needs." But Emma's body had already moved into full crisis mode. The psychological trauma was manifesting physically, her nervous system completely overwhelmed. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, with face at the end of it, that face that had haunted her nightmares for months, that face that represented everything dark and terrible in her young life. She tried to look away, to break the eye contact that felt like it was drowning her, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, frozen in terror just like she'd been frozen in that closet, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to do anything but wait for the next terrible thing to happen. The courtroom had erupted in concerned whispers, but Emma couldn't hear them. All she could hear was her own heart pounding in her ears like a drum, faster and faster, and underneath that sound, a memory's voice from that night, cold and cruel. "You think anyone cares about you? You think anyone would believe a worthless little girl like you? You're nothing. You're less than nothing." Emma's right hand slipped from the armrest, falling limply to her side. Her body was shutting down, retreating into itself, trying to protect her from a threat it perceived as immediate and deadly. In her mind, she was 8 years old in a courtroom in Michigan. But in her heart, in her nervous system, in every cell of her body, she was 7 years old in a dark closet, trapped and terrified, and certain that something terrible was about to happen. Judge stood up from her bench, her decision made. "I'm calling a recess immediately." But before she could finish her sentence, Emma's fingers moved in a specific pattern against her thigh, 3 quick taps, 2 small circles, 1 firm press. It was the signal, the emergency signal she and Buddy had practiced over and over in Sarah's living room, in Dr. Foster's office, in the park on sunny afternoons when the world felt safe. It was muscle memory, her body acting on instinct when her conscious mind had completely shut down. The signal that would change everything. Buddy's head snapped toward Emma's hand, his entire body going on alert. For 6 months, he'd been trained for this exact moment. For 6 months, his handlers had prepared him to recognize when Emma was in genuine psychological danger, when the past was overwhelming the present so completely that she needed immediate intervention. And now that moment had arrived. The golden retriever didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he rose to his feet, his usual gentle demeanor transforming into focused, purposeful action. This was what he'd been trained for. This was why he existed. Emma needed him and nothing, not the courtroom full of people, not the judge on her bench, not the rules of court procedure, was going to stop him from doing his job. What happened next would shock everyone in courtroom 7B, and would ultimately change how the American legal system handled traumatized child witnesses forever. Buddy moved with a speed and precision that shocked everyone watching. One moment he was sitting calmly beside Emma's chair, and the next he was in motion, a 70-pound golden retriever transforming from gentle companion to protective guardian in the space of a heartbeat. His muscular body launched forward, positioning himself directly between Emma and the rest of the courtroom, with the kind of deliberate placement that could only come from extensive training. His front paws landed solidly on Emma's lap, and the impact seemed to jolt her slightly from her dissociative state. The weight of him, the realness of him, created a physical barrier between her present reality and the terrifying memories trying to pull her under. Buddy's warm brown eyes locked onto Emma's face with an intensity that demanded her attention, demanded that she focus on him instead of the demons in her mind. And then he began to bark. The sound exploded through the hushed courtroom like a cannon blast. It wasn't the playful bark of a pet at home or the aggressive snarl of an attacked dog. It was something else entirely. It was purposeful, insistent, urgent. Each bark seemed carefully measured, designed to cut through Emma's psychological fog and anchor her to the present moment. The sound reverberated off the high ceilings and wooden panels, making it impossible for anyone in the room to focus on anything else. "What in the bailiff exclaimed, moving toward the witness stand with his hand instinctively going to his belt, though he carried no weapon beyond a radio and baton. "Bailiff, wait," Judge commanded, rising from her bench, her eyes wide with surprise but her hand raised to stop any intervention. Something in her gut told her to pause, to watch, to see what was happening before reacting. In 30 years on the bench, she developed an instinct for when to follow protocol and when to trust that something extraordinary was unfolding. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators in the gallery stood up, craning their necks to see what was happening. Several people gasped. Jury members looked at each other in confusion, some alarmed, others simply shocked. The court reporter's hands hovered frozen over her keyboard, unsure whether to record dog barking in the official transcript. "Order, everyone remain seated." Judge's voice cut through the noise like a blade, her gavel coming down hard. But her eyes never left the scene at the witness stand. Mr. jumped to his feet, sensing an opportunity. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. The animal is clearly out of control and—" "Mister, sit down and be quiet," snapped with such authority that the defense attorney immediately, though his face flushed with indignation. Sarah was on her feet now, her hands clasped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She recognized what was happening even if no one else did. She'd seen this before, not in a courtroom, but in her living room at 2 in the morning when Emma woke up screaming from nightmares, or in the grocery store when a man with a similar build to had walked past them, and Emma had frozen in the middle of the aisle, unable to move or speak. Buddy continued his intervention, his barking now interspersed with soft whines. His nose pressed against Emma's face, his rough tongue licking at her tears, his solid body providing the deep pressure therapy that his training had taught him was essential for someone experiencing a severe trauma response. He was doing everything he'd been taught, creating a physical barrier, demanding attention, providing tactile stimulation to ground her in reality. And it was working. Emma's glassy, unfocused eyes began to clear ever so slightly. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow to the point of hyperventilation, began to slow. Her trembling hands, which had been hanging limply at her sides, slowly rose to grasp Buddy's fur. The sensation of his soft coat under her fingers, the warmth of his body, the insistence of his presence, it was pulling her back from the edge of the psychological cliff she'd been teetering on. "Buddy," she whispered, so quietly that only those very close could hear. Her voice was hoarse, broken, but it was there. She was coming back. Dr. Foster had pushed past the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court proper, moving toward the witness stand despite the bailiff's half-hearted attempt to stop her. The therapist's professional training had kicked in, and she knew exactly what she was witnessing. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice urgent but controlled, "please don't separate them. The dog is performing a trained medical intervention." Judge's sharp eyes swung to Dr. Foster. "Explain, quickly." "Emma has severe PTSD from her time in home," Dr. Foster said rapidly, reaching the witness stand and kneeling beside Emma and Buddy, careful not to interfere with the dog's work. "Buddy isn't just a therapy dog for emotional support. He's been specifically trained to recognize and respond to Emma's panic attacks and dissociative episodes. What you just saw was Emma giving him an emergency signal. The signal means she's losing touch with reality, that the trauma is overwhelming her." Buddy's response is precisely what he's been trained to do. Ms. had stepped back, her legal mind trying to process what was happening while her human heart broke for the child before her. "I didn't know the dog could do this," she admitted to Judge. "I knew he was a therapy animal, but I didn't realize." "Neither did I," said, her eyes still fixed on Emma and Buddy. The dog had stopped barking now, but his paws remained on Emma's lap, his body still creating that protective barrier. His nose nuzzled against Emma's neck, and she had both arms wrapped around him, clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid and unstable. Sarah had joined Dr. Foster at the witness stand, and the bailiff had given up trying to maintain the usual courtroom boundaries. In the face of a child's crisis, protocol seemed suddenly less important. "Emma, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Sarah asked gently, her hand hovering near Emma's shoulder but not quite touching, letting the child set the boundaries for contact. "Sarah," Emma's voice was small, confused, like someone waking from a nightmare and not quite sure where they are. Where?" "You're in the courtroom, baby. You're safe. Buddy's got you. I've got you." "You're safe," Sarah repeated, her voice steady even as tears continued to stream down her face. But Emma's eyes, which had started to clear, suddenly darted toward the defendant's table again. Was still sitting there, now leaning forward slightly, his expression carefully arranged into one of concern and confusion, the perfect mask of an innocent man witnessing an unfortunate incident. But Emma saw through it. She could see the cold calculation behind his eyes, the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth that no one else seemed to notice. He was enjoying this, enjoying her breakdown, enjoying the power he still held over her even from across the courtroom. The realization hit Emma like a physical blow, and her breathing started to quicken again. No, she couldn't go back into that dark place. She couldn't let him win, but the fear was rising in her throat like bile, choking her, drowning her. Buddy sensed the renewed spike in her anxiety immediately. His barking resumed, louder now, more insistent. He shifted his weight on her lap, pressing down harder, the pressure releasing endorphins in Emma's brain that helped combat the cortisol and adrenaline flooding her system. It was science, it was training, but to Emma it felt like magic, like Buddy was literally holding her together when she was about to fly apart. "Your Honor, I really must object," Mr. tried again, his voice taking on a tone of exasperation. "This is highly irregular. The witness is clearly not competent to continue, and this animal is creating a disturbance that—" "Mister, I will hold you in contempt if you speak again without being addressed," Judge said, her voice like ice. She'd made her decision, and it was radical, possibly unprecedented. But watching Emma's face as she looked at, seeing the terror in that child's eyes, knew with absolute certainty what she had to do. The judge descended from her bench, something that judges simply didn't do during testimony. It broke every rule of courtroom decorum, shattered the physical and symbolic distance that the bench was meant to create. But had been a prosecutor before she'd been a judge, and before that she'd been a social worker. She'd gone into law because she'd seen too many children slip through the cracks of a system that didn't protect them, and she was damned if she was going to let it happen again in her courtroom. She approached the witness stand, and Emma looked up at her with eyes that were ancient beyond her 8 years, eyes that had seen too much, endured too much. Knelt down, bringing herself to Emma's level, her judicial robes pooling around her on the floor. Buddy paused his barking, watching this new development with alert attention but not moving from his protective position. "Emma," Judge said softly, her voice stripped of its usual judicial authority and filled instead with simple human compassion. "Look at me, sweetheart. Can you look at me?" Emma's tear-filled eyes met the judge's, and she nodded slightly. "You're very brave for being here today," continued. "Braver than many adults I know, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" Another small nod. "Is it Mr.? Is seeing him making it impossible for you to testify?" Emma's whole body trembled, but she managed to whisper, "Yes." The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Around the courtroom, people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. was preparing another objection, already formulating arguments about the defendant's constitutional right to face his accuser. Ms. was mentally reviewing case law about accommodations for child witnesses. The jury watched with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. But Judge's mind was already made up. She'd spent 3 decades in the justice system, and she'd learned that sometimes justice required bending the rules, required prioritizing the human being over the procedure. She'd also learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct she had was screaming that Emma was telling the truth. That was exactly the monster the prosecution claimed he was, and that this child deserved protection even if it meant doing something unprecedented. "Bailiff," Judge said, rising to her feet and turning to face the courtroom with an expression of absolute authority, "remove the defendant from my courtroom. Immediately." The courtroom exploded in shocked whispers and gasps. Mr. shot to his feet so fast his chair nearly toppled backward. "Your Honor, you cannot be serious. My client has a constitutional right to be present during. Your client will watch the proceedings via video feed from another room," cut him off. "And before you cite the confrontation clause at me, Mr., I suggest you review Maryland v., in which the Supreme Court held that a defendant's right to confront witnesses face-to-face may give way to the need to protect child witnesses from trauma. This child is having a medical emergency triggered by your client's presence. I am making a finding, right now, on the record, that Emma's testimony is necessary, that she would be traumatized by having to testify in his presence, and that the trauma would be more than mere nervousness or reluctance to testify." Mr.'s face had gone red. "Your Honor, Are you finished, counselor? Because my patience has reached its limit." His voice could have cut glass. The defense attorney sat down, knowing he was beaten for the moment but already planning his appeal. Judge turned to the bailiff and 2 court security officers who had appeared at the sound of the commotion. "Remove Mr. to the witness room. Set up the video feed. He can watch from there, and we will proceed when ready." As the officers approached, something flickered across his face, a crack in the carefully maintained mask of innocence. For just a moment, rage flashed in his eyes, pure and undiluted. He looked at Emma one last time, and the hatred in that look made several people in the courtroom gasp. But Emma didn't see it, because at that moment Buddy had placed his paws on either side of her face, turning her head away from and toward him instead. The dog's warm brown eyes locked with hers, and his tail wagged slightly as if to say, "I've got you. You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." And as was escorted from the courtroom, his footsteps fading down the hallway, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. The iron band of fear that had been squeezing her lungs began, ever so slightly, to loosen. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind with a decisive thud that echoed through the stunned silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Judge stood at the base of her bench, her judicial robes making her look like some ancient priestess who had just performed a sacred ritual. And in a way, she had. She'd put a child's welfare above centuries of legal tradition. Mr. remained frozen in his seat, his legal pad covered with furious scribbles of objections and appeals he was already planning. The jury sat in their box, faces ranging from shocked to relieved to confused. Several of them were looking at Emma with expressions of such profound sympathy that it was clear which way they were leaning, and the defense attorney knew it. This case, which had already been difficult, had just become nearly impossible. At the witness stand, Buddy's barking had ceased entirely. The moment's presence had been removed from the courtroom. The dog's entire demeanor had shifted. His protective stance had relaxed, though he remained close to Emma, his paws still on her lap but his weight distributed more comfortably now. His tail had begun a gentle, reassuring wag, and his tongue lolled out slightly as he panted from the exertion of his intervention. But most remarkably, Emma herself was changing. The glassy, terrified look in her eyes was gradually clearing, like fog burning off a lake in the morning sun. Her breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, was slowing to something closer to normal. The violent trembling in her hands was subsiding to a slight tremor. She was coming back from whatever dark place the trauma had dragged her into. "Emma," Dr. Foster said softly, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" Emma blinked several times as if waking from a deep sleep. Her arms remained wrapped around Buddy's neck, her face pressed into his fur, but she nodded slightly. He's gone." Her voice was muffled by the dog's coat, small and uncertain, like she didn't quite dare to believe it. "He's gone," Sarah confirmed, kneeling beside Dr. Foster, her hand joining the therapist's on Emma's other shoulder. "He's not in this room anymore. You're safe. Buddy kept you safe." Judge watched this tableau from a few feet away, her sharp legal mind already racing through the implications of what she'd just done, while her heart told her it had been absolutely the right decision. She'd broken protocol, shattered it, really. But sometimes the law needed to serve justice rather than the other way around. She took a deep breath and addressed the courtroom, her voice firm and clear. "We will take a 20-minute recess," she announced, her gavel coming down with finality. "Bailiff, ensure that the video feed is properly established in the witness room. Ms. I want you both in my chambers in 5 minutes. Court will reconvene when I determine the witness is ready to proceed. This session is in recess." The gavel struck again, and the courtroom erupted in whispers and movement. Reporters in the back row were already typing frantically on their phones, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Legal observers were debating in hushed, urgent tones about the precedent being set, but Judge paid them no attention. She was already moving back to the witness stand, her focus entirely on the traumatized child and her remarkable dog. "Emma," the judge said gently, once again kneeling to bring herself to the child's eye level, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Can you do that?" Emma slowly lifted her head from Buddy's fur, her face blotchy and tear-stained, her eyes red and swollen. But there was something different in them now, a spark of hope perhaps, or maybe just the relief of being believed, of being protected. She nodded at Judge. "What just happened was very important," continued, her voice taking on the patient, explanatory tone of a teacher rather than a judge. "That man, his presence was making it impossible for you to tell your story. That's not your fault, Emma. Do you understand me? None of this is your fault." "But I'm supposed to be brave," Emma whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I promised Tyler and Madison and that I would be brave, that I would tell everything. But when I saw him, I couldn't." "Sweetheart, look at me." Judge waited until Emma's eyes met hers. "You are the bravest person in this courtroom. Do you know why?" Emma shook her head. "Because you came here. Because you sat in that chair knowing he would be here. Because you started to tell the truth even though it was terrifying. That's what real bravery looks like, not the absence of fear, but doing the right thing despite being afraid." Paused, letting her words sink in. "And when the fear became too much, your very smart, very good dog helped you. That's what Buddy is for, isn't it?" Emma nodded, her hand stroking Buddy's ears. The repetitive motion seemed to calm her further. "Well, I'm going to help you too," continued. "Mister is no longer in this courtroom. He's in another room where he can still hear everything that's said, but you won't be able to see him and he won't be able to see you. Does that help?" Emma's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since her breakdown, something like relief crossed her face. "Really? He's really not coming back?" "Not into this room. Not while you're testifying, I promise you that." Judge's voice carried absolute conviction. "But Emma, I need to know, can you continue? Can you tell us what happened on March 15th? I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, but your testimony is crucial. You're the only one who can tell us what happened that night." Emma looked down at Buddy, whose tail wagged encouragingly. She looked at Sarah, who nodded with tears in her eyes. She looked at Dr. Foster, who gave her a small, supportive smile. And then she looked back at Judge. And in that moment, something hardened in the 8-year-old's face, a determination that seemed far too old for someone so young. "I can do it," Emma said, her voice still small but growing stronger. "If he's not here, if Buddy can stay with me, I can do it." Judge felt something catch in her throat, emotion she couldn't show, not here, not now. She simply nodded and rose to her feet. "Then we'll take our recess, give you time to compose yourself, and we'll continue. Buddy stays with you. That's non-negotiable." She turned to face the courtroom, her voice rising to address everyone present. "Let me be absolutely clear about what just occurred. This court has just witnessed a trained service animal performing a legitimate medical intervention for a witness experiencing severe trauma. What that dog did was not a disruption. It was a necessity." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the jury, the gallery, and finally landing on the space where the defense table sat. Mr. had already left for chambers, but his assistant remained, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "I am making an official finding that will be entered into the record," continued, her voice taking on the formal cadence of legal pronouncement. "Emma is a competent witness whose testimony is material to these proceedings. However, her testimony in the physical presence of the defendant causes her severe psychological trauma that goes beyond ordinary nervousness or reluctance to testify. Therefore, pursuant to Maryland v. and subsequent case law regarding child witnesses in abuse cases, I am ordering that the defendant observe the remainder of this witness's testimony via closed-circuit video feed from a separate room." The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word for the official record. Knew this decision would be scrutinized, possibly appealed, potentially overturned by a higher court. But standing here, looking at Emma's tear-stained face and the protective stance of her therapy dog, she knew in her bones that it was the right call. "Furthermore," continued, "I am officially recognizing the actions of Emma's service dog, Buddy, as a legitimate medical accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. His intervention prevented what could have been a serious medical emergency and allowed this witness to continue her testimony. Any future objections to his presence or actions will be overruled unless counsel can provide compelling legal precedent to the contrary." She turned back to Emma, her formal tone softening again. "Take your time, sweetheart. Drink some water, hold your dog. We'll start again when you're ready, not before." As Judge swept toward her chambers, her robes billowing behind her, she could hear the whispers starting up again in the gallery. She knew what they were saying. Some would call her decision brilliant, others would call it judicial overreach. Legal scholars would debate it for years, but she'd been a judge long enough to know that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that prioritized human dignity over legal tradition. In her chambers, Ms. and Mr. were already waiting, the defense attorney's face flushed with barely contained anger. "Your Honor, I must protest in the strongest possible terms," began the moment entered. "What just happened out there was a complete violation of my client's constitutional rights. The Sixth Amendment guarantees. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to confront witnesses, not to traumatize child victims," cut him off, moving behind her desk but not sitting. She wanted the height advantage. "And before you lecture me on constitutional law, Mr., let me remind you that I taught constitutional law at the University of Michigan for 5 years before I took the bench. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I know exactly what legal ground I'm standing on." She opened a thick legal tome on her desk, one of several she'd grabbed from her bookshelf, already marked with sticky notes. Maryland v. 1990. The Supreme Court held that a defendant's right to face-to-face confrontation is not absolute and can give way to the state's interest in protecting child witnesses from trauma. The court specifically stated that if face-to-face confrontation would cause a child witness serious emotional distress, such that the child could not reasonably communicate, alternative procedures are constitutionally permissible. That case involved a child testifying via closed-circuit television from another room, argued, finding his footing. Not removing the defendant while the child remains in the courtroom. The principle is the same, countered. The child is protected from direct visual contact with the defendant while the defendant retains the ability to observe and hear the testimony. Your client can still confer with you, can still help prepare cross-examination. His rights are not being violated. They're being reasonably accommodated to prevent further trauma to an 8-year-old victim. Ms., who had been silent until now, spoke up. Your Honor, for what it's worth, the prosecution supports your decision. We had no idea the witness would react so severely to the defendant's presence, but what we witnessed was clearly a legitimate trauma response, not theatrics or manipulation. Of course you support it, snapped. It benefits your case enormously, that dog's disruption. It's not a disruption, interrupted firmly. It was a trained medical response to a panic attack. Dr. Foster confirmed it, and I observed it myself. That animal very likely prevented Emma from having a complete psychological breakdown on the stand. Would you prefer that alternative, counselor? Because I assure you, if Emma had been unable to continue at all, I would have been forced to consider whether your client's appearance so prejudices potential witnesses that a fair trial is impossible. That stopped cold. The implication was clear: push too hard on this issue, and might consider even more drastic measures, possibly including declaring a mistrial and starting over with accommodations built in from the beginning. I will be filing an objection to all of this for the record, said stiffly, and I reserve the right to appeal. As is your right and duty as defense counsel, acknowledged. Your objection is noted and will be preserved for appeal, but my ruling stands. Now is the video feed operational? The bailiff, who had been standing quietly by the door, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We've got Mr. set up in the witness room with a clear view of the proceedings. Audio is working both ways. Good, then we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Looked at Ms. When we resume, I want you to proceed slowly and carefully. Watch Emma's responses. If I see signs of distress, I'll intervene. Understood? Understood, Your Honor. And Ms., when you get to the events of March 15th, be as gentle as possible. That child has been through hell. Don't make her relive it any more graphically than absolutely necessary for your case. Back in the courtroom, Emma sat in the witness chair with Buddy's head resting on her lap, his warm weight a comfort and an anchor. Sarah had brought her a bottle of water, which she sipped slowly while Dr. Foster talked to her in low, soothing tones about breathing exercises and grounding techniques. You did so well, Emma, Dr. Foster said softly. What Buddy did, what you did by giving him that signal, that was exactly right. You recognized you needed help and you asked for it. That's incredibly brave and incredibly smart. I was so scared, Emma admitted, her voice barely audible. When I looked at him, it was like I was back there, like it was happening all over again. That's called a flashback, remember? We've talked about those. Dr. Foster kept her voice calm and educational, helping Emma understand her own reactions. Your brain was trying to protect you by treating the memory like a current threat. But you're not back there, Emma. You're here, you're safe, and that man can't hurt you anymore. Emma nodded, her fingers continuing their rhythmic stroking of Buddy's ears. The dog's presence was like a lifeline, keeping her tethered to reality. Dr. Foster, do you think the other kids will be proud of me for still trying? Oh, sweetheart, Dr. Foster said, her own eyes filling with tears. They're going to be so proud of you. You're showing them that it's possible to tell the truth, that grown-ups will protect them. You're giving them courage. When Judge returned to the bench 15 minutes later, the courtroom had been rearranged. Emma's chair had been turned slightly so that, even if she glanced toward the defendant's table, she wouldn't see the video monitor that had been set up for Mr. to consult with his client. The prosecutor's table had been moved to create a more protective barrier around the witness stand. And most notably, a small space heater had been brought in and positioned near Emma, because someone had noticed she was shivering, Whether from cold or nerves, it didn't matter. Comfort mattered. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, and the courtroom stood as Judge took her seat. "You may be seated," said, her gaze immediately going to Emma. The child looked fragile but determined, one hand buried in Buddy's fur, the other wrapped around her water bottle. "Ms., are you ready to continue?" Emma took a deep breath, looked at Buddy, looked at Sarah in the gallery, and then looked at Judge. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and though her voice shook slightly, there was steel underneath it. "Then let's proceed. Ms., you may continue your examination." And as the prosecutor approached the witness stand once more, every person in that courtroom understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a trial, but a moment when the justice system bent itself around the needs of a child, when rules gave way to compassion, and when a dog's love proved more powerful than a monster's intimidation. Ms. approached the witness stand with careful, measured steps, as if approaching a wounded bird that might startle at any sudden movement. The courtroom had taken on a different quality now, quieter, more focused, charged with the understanding that what they were about to hear would be difficult but essential. Emma watched the prosecutor approach, her small hand still buried in Buddy's golden fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Emma," Ms. began, her voice gentle but clear enough to carry through the courtroom, "I know you've been incredibly brave today. I'm going to ask you about March 15th now, but I want you to know that you can take breaks whenever you need them. If you need to stop, just say so. If you need a minute with Buddy, take it. There's no rush, okay?" Emma nodded, swallowing hard. Without physical presence in the room, she felt like she could breathe again, like there was space for the truth to exist. "Okay," she whispered. "Can you tell me what day of the week March 15th was?" "It was a Saturday," Emma said, her voice growing slightly stronger. This was an easy question, a gentle beginning. "I remember because we didn't have school, which meant we had to do extra chores. Mister always gave us more work on weekends." "What kind of chores?" Ms. asked, building the context slowly, letting Emma ease into the story rather than diving straight into the trauma. "Everything. Cleaning the whole house, scrubbing floors, washing windows, doing all the laundry. Yard work if the weather was nice. He'd make a list every Friday night, and if we didn't finish everything by dinner on Saturday, we'd get punished." Emma's fingers tightened in Buddy's fur, but the dog remained calm, his presence a constant reassurance. "And on this particular Saturday, March 15th, did you finish all your chores?" Emma's face clouded and her breathing quickened slightly. Buddy immediately pressed more firmly against her leg, and she felt the pressure, the grounding sensation that reminded her she was safe. "I tried," she said, her voice trembling. "I really tried. But the list was so long and some of the stuff was hard for me to do by myself. I'm not very tall, and reaching the high windows was really difficult." Ms. nodded encouragingly. "That makes sense. You were only 7 years old at the time. What happened when you couldn't finish everything?" "Mister came to check our work around 5 o'clock. He went through the whole house with this clipboard, marking down everything that wasn't perfect. When he got to the living room windows," Emma paused, her breath hitching, "there were streaks on the high ones. I tried to use a step stool, but I couldn't reach properly. He got really quiet, which was always scarier than when he yelled." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter's typing had become softer, as if she too was trying not to break the fragile spell of Emma's testimony. "What did Mister do?" Ms. prompted gently. "He told me I was lazy and worthless. He said I'd done it on purpose to spite him, which wasn't true. I really had tried." Tears were streaming down Emma's face now, but her voice remained steady, as if she'd made a decision to get through this no matter what. "He said I needed to learn a lesson about doing things properly. He told the other kids to go to their rooms, and then he grabbed my arm really hard and dragged me toward the closet under the stairs." Several jury members leaned forward, their faces etched with concern and anger. Sarah was crying silently in the gallery, her hand pressed to her mouth. "The closet under the stairs," Ms. repeated. "Can you describe it?" Emma closed her eyes, and for a moment Dr. Foster tensed, worried she might be dissociating again. But when Emma opened her eyes, they were clear, focused. She was remembering, but she was staying present. It's tiny, maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. There's no light in there. Mr. kept cleaning supplies and old boxes in it, so there wasn't much room. You couldn't stand up straight because of the stairs above, and you couldn't really sit down properly either. You just had to kind of crouch or curl up. And Mr. put you in this closet. He shoved me in and slammed the door. I heard the lock click. Emma's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but the microphone picked up every word. It was completely dark. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hand in front of my face, and it smelled like chemicals from the cleaning supplies. It made my eyes burn and my throat hurt. Ms. paused, letting the jury absorb this image. A 7-year-old child locked in a dark, cramped space filled with chemical fumes. How long were you in there, Emma? I don't know exactly. I didn't have a watch or a phone, but it felt like forever. Emma's breathing was getting faster, and Buddy responded by placing his paw on her leg, a gentle reminder that he was there. I could hear the other kids eating dinner. I heard dishes and chairs scraping and Mr. talking to them. My stomach hurt because I was so hungry. I'd only had a piece of toast for breakfast and nothing for lunch because I'd been working on the chores. Did you call out, ask to be let out? Emma nodded vigorously. At first, yes. I knocked on the door and said I was sorry, that I'd do better next time, but nobody came. After a while, I had to go to the bathroom really bad. I held it as long as I could, but... Her voice broke, shame flooding her face. I couldn't hold it anymore. I wet myself. And then I was sitting in the dark in wet clothes, and I was so cold and so ashamed. The courtroom collectively held its breath. This detail, this humiliating, degrading detail, painted a picture of cruelty that went beyond mere punishment into deliberate torture. Did anyone come to let you out that night? Ms. asked. No, I fell asleep eventually, kind of hunched against the wall. I woke up a few times when I heard footsteps and I'd call out, but nobody came. I thought maybe he forgot about me. Or maybe, Emma's voice dropped even lower, maybe he wanted me to die in there. Why would you think that, Emma? Because that's what he said once to Tyler. When Tyler asked for extra food because he was still hungry, Mr. said maybe he should just let us all starve, that the state would pay him whether we were alive or dead. So what difference did it make? Emma looked up at Ms., her eyes ancient and sad. He made us feel like we were worthless, like we didn't matter to anyone. Judge's jaw clenched, her hands gripping her gavel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd presided over many disturbing cases, but hearing a child articulate this kind of psychological abuse was particularly gut-wrenching. Let's talk about the next morning, Sunday, March 16th. What happened? Ms. asked. Emma took a shaky breath and Buddy shifted closer, his warm body a solid presence against her. I woke up because I heard the lock clicking open. Light came flooding in and it hurt my eyes because they'd adjusted to the dark. Mr. was standing there and he looked angry, really angry. What did he say? He said I'd better have learned my lesson. He asked if I was going to be lazy again and I said no, I promised I wouldn't be. I was so scared. He pulled me out of the closet and my legs didn't work right at first because I'd been cramped up for so long. I almost fell. Emma's voice cracked. He didn't help me. He just watched me struggle to stand up. What happened next? This was it, the crucial part, the incident that had finally brought the whole house of horrors crashing down. Emma's breathing quickened, but she pressed her face briefly into Buddy's fur, drew strength from him, and continued. He told me to go clean myself up and then come help make breakfast. I went to the bathroom and tried to wash up in the sink, but I didn't have clean clothes in there. I was still wearing the wet, dirty clothes from the night before. When I came out, Madison was in the hallway. She saw me and started crying. She knew where I'd been. She knew what had happened. Emma paused and Ms. gave her a moment. Take your time, Emma. Madison hugged me and she whispered that she was going to tell. I begged her not to because I was scared of what he'd do, but she said she couldn't keep the secret anymore. She said it was wrong and someone had to know. Emma's voice filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. She saved us. Madison saved us all. What did Madison do? She had a phone. Not a smartphone, just an old flip phone that she'd found in a drawer and hidden in her room. Mister didn't know she had it. While I was in the bathroom trying to clean up properly, Madison went into her room and called 911. She told them there were kids being hurt at the house, that it was an emergency. The courtroom stirred with whispers of relief, of vindication. Finally, someone had helped. Finally, these children had been heard. "Do you know what happened next?" Ms. asked. The police came. I was in the kitchen by then trying to make eggs like Mr. told me to, but my hands were shaking so bad I kept dropping things. When the doorbell rang, Mr. got this look on his face, panic but also anger. He told us all to stay quiet and act normal. He went to answer the door and I could hear him talking to the police officers, saying there must be some mistake, that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine, was it? Ms. said gently. Emma shook her head. No, one of the police officers, a woman with kind eyes, asked if she could come in and look around. Mr. said yes because he couldn't really say no. She came into the kitchen and saw me standing there in dirty clothes that smelled like urine, with my hair all matted and my face probably showing that I'd been crying all night. She asked me if I was okay, and I wanted to say yes because that's what Mr. expected, but I couldn't. I just started crying. What did the officer do? She knelt down and told me I was safe, that she was going to help. Then she called for the other officers to come in and they started looking around the house. They found the locks on our bedroom doors. They found the padlocks on the kitchen cabinets. They found the closet where I'd been locked up. My wet clothes were still in there as evidence. They found Madison with the phone and she told them everything. Emma's voice had grown stronger as she spoke, as if recounting the rescue was empowering her. They took pictures of everything. They took pictures of the bruises on my arms where Mr. had grabbed me. They called Child Protective Services, and they arrested Mr. I watched through the window as they put handcuffs on him and put him in the police car. How did that make you feel? Ms. asked. Scared, Emma admitted, but also relieved, like maybe we'd finally be okay, like maybe someone finally believed us. She looked directly at the jury now, her young face fierce with determination. Mr. told us no one would ever believe us. He said we were just foster kids that nobody wanted and his word would always matter more than ours. But he was wrong. The police believed us. The social workers believed us. And now you're listening to me, which means I matter. We all matter. The impact of her words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Several jury members were openly crying now. Even the bailiff, who'd maintained a stoic expression throughout the proceedings, had to look away and blink rapidly. Ms. let the moment breathe, let Emma's words settle into everyone's consciousness. Then she asked one final question. Emma, everything you've told us today, is it the truth? Yes, ma'am, Emma said without hesitation. Every word. I promised myself when I came here that I would tell the truth no matter what, because Tyler and Madison and deserve justice. All the kids who were hurt by Mr. deserve justice. And maybe if I tell the truth, he can never hurt anyone else ever again. Thank you, Emma, Ms. said softly. Thank you for your courage. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge looked at Emma with undisguised admiration and compassion. Mister, do you wish to cross-examine this witness? There was a long pause. Through the video feed was probably screaming at his attorney to tear apart Emma's testimony, to find the holes to discredit her. But Mr. was an experienced lawyer, and he knew that sometimes cross-examining a sympathetic witness, especially a child who had just bared her soul, did more harm than good. Attacking Emma now would only make the jury hate more. No questions at this time, Your Honor, said reluctantly. Then this witness is excused. Emma, you can step down. His voice was gentle. You did beautifully, sweetheart. You should be very proud of yourself. As Emma climbed down from the witness stand, Buddy at her side, Sarah rushed forward to embrace her. Dr. Foster wrapped her arms around both of them, and for the first time in hours, Emma allowed herself to truly cry, not from fear or trauma, but from relief. She'd done it. She'd told the truth. And finally, someone had listened. The 20-minute recess Judge called felt like both an eternity and an instant. Emma sat in a small witness waiting room just off the main courtroom, curled up on a worn leather couch with Buddy sprawled across her lap, his weight a comforting anchor. Sarah sat beside her, one arm wrapped protectively around the child's shoulders, while Dr. Foster sat across from them, watching Emma's face carefully for any signs of delayed trauma response. "You were amazing in there," Sarah said softly, pressing a kiss to the top of Emma's head. "I am so proud of you." "Is it over?" Emma asked, her voice small and tired. The adrenaline that had carried her through the testimony was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Can we go home now?" Dr. Foster leaned forward, her voice gentle but honest. "Not quite yet, sweetheart. The prosecutor is done asking you questions, but the judge needs to make some official statements about what happened today. You might need to be there for that. And then there will be other witnesses, Tyler, Madison, and will testify too, remember, plus the police officers and social workers." Emma nodded, her fingers working through Buddy's fur in that rhythmic pattern that helped keep her calm. "Will Mr. be back in the courtroom?" "Not while you're there," Sarah assured her firmly. "Judge made sure of that, and honestly, honey, after what happened today, I don't think she'll let him back in while any of you kids testify." In Judge's chambers, a very different conversation was taking place. The judge sat behind her massive oak desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed case law on her computer screen. Ms. and Mr. sat in the chairs across from her, the tension between them palpable. "Your Honor," began, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "I want to reiterate my objection to these proceedings. What happened today, removing my client from the courtroom, allowing that animal to disrupt testimony, sets a dangerous precedent. Every defendant accused of a crime against a child could potentially be barred from their own trial based on claims of trauma." Judge removed her glasses and fixed with a steely gaze. "Counselor, let me be very clear about something. What we witnessed today was not theatrics or manipulation. That child had a genuine, medically documented panic attack triggered by your client's presence. Her therapy dog responded with a trained medical intervention that likely prevented a complete psychological collapse. This wasn't about making things easier for the prosecution. This was about preventing re-traumatization of a child victim." "But the precedent started." "The precedent was set by the Supreme Court in Maryland v. interrupted. "I've spent the last 15 minutes reviewing not just that case, but also Commonwealth v. Johnson, State v. and People v. all cases where courts have made accommodations for traumatized child witnesses. What I did today falls well within established legal parameters." She turned to her computer screen, reading from one of the cases. In Commonwealth v. Johnson, the Massachusetts Supreme Court held that the trial court may employ measures necessary to protect child witnesses from trauma when such measures preserve the essential elements of confrontation. Your client could still see and hear Emma's testimony, mister. He could still consult with you. The essential elements of confrontation were preserved. Ms. spoke up. "Your Honor, if I may, the prosecution believes what happened today actually strengthens the integrity of these proceedings. Emma was able to give complete, coherent testimony about events she couldn't even speak about when the defendant was in the room. The jury got a fuller, more accurate picture of what happened. Isn't that what the justice system is supposed to do, seek truth? The justice system is also supposed to protect the rights of the accused," shot back. "My client has been convicted in the eyes of that jury based on the emotional reaction of a child and a dog. How is he supposed to get a fair trial when the judge herself has essentially declared him so dangerous that a child can't bear to look at him?" Judge's eyes flashed. "I declared no such thing. I made a finding that this particular child witness experienced severe trauma in the defendant's care, and that his physical presence triggered a medical crisis. That's not a declaration of guilt, mister. That's a recognition of documented psychological harm. The jury will determine guilt or innocence based on the evidence, not on my rulings about witness accommodation. She stood up, signaling the meeting was coming to an end. Here's what's going to happen. When we reconvene, I'm going to make a formal statement on the record explaining my decisions today. I'm going to cite the relevant case law, and I'm going to establish the parameters for how we'll handle the remaining child witnesses. If they express similar trauma responses to the defendant's presence, we'll employ the same accommodations. If they don't, we won't. Each witness will be evaluated individually. And the dog asked, "Are we going to allow therapy animals for every witness now?" If a witness has a documented disability and a trained service animal that provides necessary medical support, then yes, absolutely, said firmly. The ADA requires reasonable accommodations, and I will not deny a child witness the medical support they need simply because it's unprecedented. Sometimes, mister, the law needs to catch up with our understanding of trauma and healing. Back in the courtroom, word had spread about what had happened. The gallery was now packed with not just the usual court observers, but also several reporters, legal advocates, and representatives from children's rights organizations who had heard about Judge's unprecedented ruling. The air buzzed with whispered conversations about service animals, trauma-informed justice, and whether this case would change how courts handled vulnerable witnesses. When Judge returned to the bench, the bailiff's call of "all rise" seemed to carry extra weight. Everyone in the courtroom understood they were witnessing something significant, something that might be cited in law textbooks and legal briefs for years to come. "Please be seated," said, settling into her chair and arranging her notes before her. She waited until the courtroom was completely silent before speaking. "Before we proceed with additional witnesses, I want to make a formal statement for the record regarding the events that occurred during Emma's testimony." She paused, looking out at the packed gallery, at the jury, at the lawyers, and finally at the small figure of Emma, who had been brought back into the courtroom at request and now sat in the front row with Sarah and Dr. Foster, Buddy at her feet. "Today, this court witnessed something that I believe represents both a challenge and an opportunity for our justice system," began, her voice carrying the weight of careful consideration. "We saw a child witness experience a severe trauma response while attempting to testify against her alleged abuser. We saw a trained service animal intervene with a medical response that prevented what could have been a serious psychological crisis. And we saw the legal system adapt in real time to protect a vulnerable witness while still preserving the constitutional rights of the accused." She looked down at her notes, then back up, speaking now without reading. "I want to be very clear about the legal basis for the decisions I made. Under Maryland v. 497 U.S. 836, the Supreme Court held that a defendant's right to face-to-face confrontation with witnesses is not absolute. The court recognized that in cases involving child witnesses, particularly in abuse cases, the confrontation clause must sometimes yield to other important interests, specifically, the interest in protecting child witnesses from trauma." Several people in the gallery were taking notes frantically. This was exactly the kind of judicial reasoning that would be studied and debated. "The Supreme Court established a test," continued. "The trial court must determine that, 1. The witness would be traumatized by the defendant's presence. 2. The trauma would be more than mere nervousness or reluctance to testify. 3. The emotional distress would be caused by the defendant's presence rather than by courtroom proceedings generally. And 4. The trauma would impair the witness's ability to communicate." She ticked off each point on her fingers. "Based on my observations today, all 4 elements were clearly met. Emma experienced what Dr. Rachel Foster, a licensed trauma specialist, confirmed was a severe panic attack. This was not nervousness. This was a medical emergency. The attack was specifically triggered when Emma made eye contact with the defendant, and it rendered her unable to speak or continue her testimony. Judge's voice grew stronger, more passionate. As for the intervention by Emma's service dog, Buddy, I am making an official finding that this was a legitimate medical accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Buddy is not merely a pet or an emotional support animal. He is a trained service animal who responds to specific signals that indicate his handler is experiencing a medical crisis. What we witnessed was not a disruption. It was a dog doing exactly what he was trained to do, providing necessary medical support to a person with a disability. She looked directly at Emma now, her stern, judicial expression softening. Emma, I want you to understand something. What Buddy did today was remarkable. He protected you when you needed protection. He helped you when you couldn't help yourself. And by doing so, he allowed you to find your voice and tell your truth. That's not just good therapy, that's justice at work. Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in Buddy's fur. The dog's tail wagged gently, and several people in the gallery smiled despite the serious nature of the proceedings. Turned back to address the full courtroom. I'm therefore establishing the following protocols for the remainder of this trial. Any child witness who experiences similar trauma responses will be afforded the same accommodations. The defendant will observe via video feed if necessary. Service animals will be permitted when they provide documented medical support. And this court will prioritize the psychological safety of child witnesses while still preserving all constitutional protections for the accused. She paused, letting her words sink in. I am aware that these decisions may be appealed. I am aware that some will argue I've overstepped my authority, but I took an oath to administer justice, and justice cannot be served if witnesses are too traumatized to testify. The law exists to serve people, not the other way around. Mr. Rose, Your Honor, for the record, the defense objects to all of these rulings and will be filing appropriate motions. Your objection is noted and preserved for appeal. Acknowledged. Ms., call your next witness. Over the next 3 days, Tyler, Madison, and each took the stand. Each child told their own story of life in house, stories that corroborated Emma's testimony in heartbreaking detail. Tyler, now 13, described being locked in his room for 3 days and emerging so weak he could barely stand. Madison, 11, told about the infection she'd developed from being bathroom access and how it accused her of faking illness for attention. And Little, just 6 years old now, sat in the witness chair with her own therapy dog and described in simple language how hungry she'd always been, how scared she'd always felt. Watched it all via video feed, his carefully constructed facade crumbling a little more with each testimony. And through it all, Judge's precedent-setting ruling stood firm, protecting these vulnerable witnesses while still preserving right to a fair trial. Legal experts who watched the proceedings called it revolutionary. Children's advocates called it long overdue. Defense attorneys worried about implications for their clients. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something fundamental had shifted in that Michigan courtroom, something that recognized that true justice sometimes required the courage to do things differently. And at the center of it all was an 8-year-old girl and her golden retriever, who together had shown the legal system what it looked like when compassion and law worked hand in hand. When the prosecution rested its case, Ms. stood and addressed the court one final time before the defense began. Your Honor, I want to thank you for your rulings this week. Because of your courage, 4 children were able to tell their stories without being re-traumatized. That's what justice should look like. Judge nodded but said simply, justice should always protect the vulnerable while seeking truth. That's not revolutionary, Ms. That's just the law doing what it's supposed to do. But everyone in that courtroom knew it was revolutionary, whether wanted to claim that mantle or not. And they knew that years from now, law students would study rule, as the case that changed how America's courts treated traumatized child witnesses. All because a little girl gave a signal, a dog responded, and a judge had the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most important precedents are set when we choose humanity over habit. 2 weeks after Emma's testimony, the jury filed back into courtroom 7B after deliberating for just 4.5 hours. The speed of their decision surprised no one who had watched the trial unfold. Emma sat in the gallery between Sarah and Dr. Foster, with Buddy's head resting on her feet. She'd asked to be there for the verdict, insisting that she needed to see this through to the end. Sarah had been hesitant, worried about exposing Emma to more potential trauma, but Dr. Foster had ultimately supported the decision. She needs closure, the therapist had explained to Sarah the night before. She needs to see that telling the truth mattered, that the system worked, that justice is real and not just something adults talk about. Now, as the jury foreman stood with the verdict form in his hand, Emma felt her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Buddy sensed her anxiety immediately and pressed more firmly against her legs, providing that grounding pressure that always helped. She reached down to stroke his ears, drawing strength from his calm, steady presence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked, her voice formal but with an undertone of anticipation that even her decades of judicial experience couldn't quite hide. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. He was an older man, a retired teacher who had sat in the front row of the jury box throughout the trial, his expression growing darker with each child's testimony. "On the count of child endangerment in the first degree regarding Emma, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty, Your Honor." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. Sarah wrapped her arm around the child's shoulders, pulling her close. "On the count of child endangerment in the first degree regarding Tyler, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of child endangerment in the first degree regarding Madison, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the count of child endangerment in the first degree regarding Williams, how do you find?" "Guilty." The foreman continued through all the counts, 12 in total, covering various charges of abuse, neglect, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. On every single count, the verdict was the same: guilty, guilty, guilty. By the time the foreman finished reading, several jury members were crying openly. Sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and expressionless, but his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. For the first time since the trial began, his carefully maintained mask had completely slipped. He looked like what he truly was, a convicted child abuser facing serious prison time. Judge polled each juror individually, confirming their verdicts, then thanked them for their service. "This was not an easy case to hear," she told them, her voice thick with emotion. "You listened to testimony that was disturbing and heartbreaking. You served with patience and wisdom, and on behalf of the state of Michigan and the children whose voices you heard, I thank you." She set a sentencing date for 3 weeks later and dismissed the jury. As they filed out, several of them looked toward Emma and the other children who had gathered in the gallery. One woman, a mother of 3 herself, gave Emma a small nod and mouthed, "Thank you for being brave." The sentencing hearing, 3 weeks later, brought all 4 children back to the courtroom one final time. But this time it was different. This time couldn't hurt them anymore. This time they weren't testifying against him. They were simply watching justice be served. Judge had reviewed the pre-sentencing report, which included psychological evaluations, victim impact statements, and recommendations from various experts. The prosecution was asking for the maximum sentence, 15 years in prison. The defense was arguing for leniency, claiming had himself been a victim of abuse as a child and that he needed treatment, not punishment. But when Judge began to speak, it was clear which argument had resonated with her. "Mister," she began, looking directly at the defendant, who now stood before her in an orange jail jumpsuit, his expensive suits a thing of the past. I have presided over criminal cases for nearly 30 years. I have seen many defendants come through this courtroom, some who committed crimes of passion, some who made terrible mistakes, some who were products of their circumstances. And then there are defendants like you. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You didn't commit a crime of passion. You didn't make a mistake. You systematically, deliberately, and methodically abused 4 vulnerable children who had been placed in your care by a system designed to protect them. You exploited their vulnerability. You weaponized their fear. You told them no one would believe them, no one would care about them, that they were worthless. His voice grew stronger, more forceful. But you were wrong, mister. They were believed. They were cared for. And they are not worthless. They are some of the bravest people I've ever had the privilege of meeting. She looked down at her notes, then back up at, the pre-sentencing report indicates you experienced abuse as a child yourself. If that's true, I'm sorry for what you endured. But it does not excuse, it does not even explain what you did to these children. You had a choice. You could have broken the cycle of abuse. Instead, you perpetuated it. You became the very monster that perhaps once haunted your own childhood. Emma watched from the gallery, holding Sarah's hand on one side and Buddy's leash on the other. She felt strange, sad, angry, relieved, and somehow empty all at once. Dr. Foster had warned her that justice, when it finally came, might not feel the way she expected. Closure isn't always neat, the therapist had said. Sometimes it's complicated and messy and bittersweet. Judge continued. This court must consider several factors in sentencing: the nature of the crimes, the harm to the victims, the likelihood of rehabilitation, and the need to protect society. In this case, all factors point in the same direction. She looked directly at again. You held positions of power over children who had no one else to protect them. You betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The psychological harm you inflicted on these children will take years, perhaps lifetimes, to heal. And based on your complete lack of remorse throughout these proceedings, I see no evidence that you recognize the gravity of what you've done, let alone that you've truly changed. Picked up her gavel, and the courtroom went utterly silent. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 15 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections on each count of child endangerment in the first degree, to be served consecutively. That's a total of 60 years, mister. You will also be required to register as a child abuser upon your release. You are prohibited from ever fostering or adopting children, and you will be subject to supervised probation for the remainder of your life. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo forever. 60 years. Would be over 100 years old before he saw freedom again, which meant, practically speaking, he would likely die in prison. Emma felt something break loose in her chest, a tight knot of fear and anxiety that had been there for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of relief. It was over. It was really over. As deputies led from the courtroom, he looked back one last time. His eyes swept across the gallery, landing on each of the 4 children whose testimony had sealed his fate. But where once his gaze had carried power and intimidation, now it held nothing but impotent rage. He couldn't hurt them anymore. He'd never be able to hurt any child ever again. After the sentencing, Judge did something unprecedented for the second time in this case. She invited Emma, Tyler, Madison, and their foster families into her chambers. The children sat in a row on the leather couch while pulled up a chair to sit at their level, just as she'd done during Emma's testimony. I want you all to know something, said, her judicial sternness replaced with warmth and sincerity. What you did, testifying, telling your truth, being brave enough to face your abuser, that wasn't just important for your own case. It's going to help other children too. Emma looked up confused. How? Smiled. Because what happened in this courtroom is going to change things. Other judges around the country are already calling me, asking about the accommodations we made for you. They want to know how to protect child witnesses better. Law schools are going to teach about this case, and all because you were brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was terrifying. She looked specifically at Emma and Buddy, who lay at her feet. And Emma, what Buddy did for you, that's going to help so many other children who have service animals. Courts are going to be more understanding, more accommodating. You and Buddy showed everyone how important these animals are, how they're not just pets but genuine medical support. Tyler spoke up, his voice deeper than Emma remembered from their time in his house. He'd grown taller in the past months, no longer the malnourished, frightened 12-year-old who tried so hard to protect the younger children. So it mattered. Everything we went through in that courtroom, it mattered. It mattered more than you can possibly know, assured him. You four are heroes. You might not feel like heroes. You might just feel like kids who survived something terrible. But you are heroes. And I want you to remember that on the hard days when the memories feel too heavy, when the healing feels too slow. You change the world a little bit. That's what heroes do. The impact of the case rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Within 6 months, 3 other states had implemented protocols, official guidelines for accommodating traumatized child witnesses, including provisions for service animals and alternative testimony arrangements. The National Center for Child Advocacy held a conference where Judge was the keynote speaker, discussing trauma-informed courtroom practices. Dr. Foster was invited to consult on a national task force developing training programs for therapy dogs who work with child trauma survivors. She brought Emma and Buddy to several conferences, where Emma, growing more confident with each passing month, spoke briefly about her experience. "Buddy saved me," she would say simply, and audiences would be moved to tears. Sarah formally adopted Emma 8 months after the trial concluded. On the day the adoption was finalized, they returned to Judge's courtroom, but this time for a celebration, not a trial. Presided over the adoption proceedings with Buddy sitting proudly beside Emma, wearing a bow tie for the special occasion. "This is what this courtroom should be used for," said as she signed the adoption decree. "Not just for punishing those who harm children, but for creating families who love them. Emma, or should I say, Emma, you have found your forever home." Emma, now 9 years old and noticeably healthier, taller, and more vibrant than the fragile child who had months earlier, smiled widely. "Can Buddy be officially adopted too?" she asked, and everyone in the courtroom laughed. "I think Buddy adopted you a long time ago," said with a warm smile. "But yes, we can make sure the paperwork reflects that he's part of the family now too." Tyler, Madison, and had also found new placements. Tyler was thriving with a family who encouraged his love of science and had already helped him catch up on 2 years of missed education. Madison was with a patient couple who understood her need for routine and safety, and she was slowly regaining the confidence had stripped from her. And Little, now 7, had been placed with a grandmother she'd never met, a woman who was making up for lost time by showering the child with the love and stability she'd always deserved. They all stayed in touch, these 4 children whose shared trauma had bonded them forever. They met once a month at Dr. Foster's office for group therapy, which had evolved from painful processing sessions into something more like family reunions. They celebrated birthdays together, shared victories and setbacks, and reminded each other that they were survivors, not victims. 1 year after the trial, Emma received a letter at school. It was from a girl named Jessica in California who had watched news coverage of the trial with her mother. Jessica wrote, "Dear Emma, I am 8 years old like you were when I'm also in foster care, and my foster dad hurt me too. I was too scared to tell anyone, but then my mom, my new foster mom, who is nice, showed me the news about you and Buddy. You were so brave. Because of you, I told my teacher what happened. Now I'm safe and the bad man can't hurt me anymore. Thank you for being brave first. You saved me even though you don't know me. I hope I can have a dog like Buddy someday. Love, Jessica." When Emma read the letter, she cried. But this time, the tears were different. They were tears of purpose, of meaning, of understanding that her pain had somehow been transformed into protection for another child she'd never met. She showed the letter to Judge during a visit to the courthouse, read it carefully, then looked at Emma with shining eyes. "Do you understand now?" she asked. "Do you see why telling the truth mattered so much?" Emma nodded, clutching Buddy close. "I think I do. My story helped Jessica tell hers, and maybe Jessica's story will help someone else." "That's exactly right," said. "That's how we change the world. One brave voice at a time, one truth at a time, one child finding the courage to speak because another child showed them it was possible." 3 years later, Emma was a thriving sixth grader who wanted to become either a veterinarian or a lawyer. She couldn't quite decide which. Buddy, now graying around the muzzle but still devoted, accompanied her to school every day as her registered service animal. They'd become something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools about the power of service animals and the importance of speaking up about abuse. And in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., a new bill was being debated, the Trauma-Informed Justice for Child Witnesses Act, nicknamed Emma's Law by its sponsors. The bill would create national standards for accommodating child witnesses in abuse cases, explicitly protecting the right of child witnesses to have service animals present during testimony, and providing funding for trauma training for judges and attorneys who work with child victims. When Emma heard about the bill, she was speechless. Sarah had to explain it 3 times before Emma fully understood that lawmakers in Washington were creating a law inspired by her case, by her testimony, by what she and Buddy had done together in that Michigan courtroom. "Does this mean other kids won't be as scared as I was?" Emma asked. "That's exactly what it means," Sarah said, hugging her tight. "Because you were brave, other children won't have to be quite as brave. They'll have rules protecting them, judges who understand trauma and the right to bring their support animals. You gave them that gift, Emma." On the 5th anniversary of her testimony, Emma returned to Judge's courtroom one final time, was retiring after 35 years on the bench, and she'd specifically requested that Emma be present for her final day. The courtroom was packed with lawyers, colleagues, family, and friends who had come to honor her distinguished career. But when gave her farewell address, she spoke mostly about one case. "In 3.5 decades as a judge, I've presided over thousands of cases," said, her voice carrying through the crowded courtroom. "I've made decisions that I hope made this world a little more just, a little more fair. But if I'm remembered for only one thing, I hope it's for the day I chose to listen to a little girl and her dog, to prioritize compassion over convention, and to remember that justice means protecting the vulnerable." She looked directly at Emma, who sat in the front row with Buddy, now a senior dog but still alert and devoted, at her feet. "Emma, when you walked into this courtroom 5 years ago, you were a frightened child who had every reason to believe that the system would fail you just as so many systems had failed you before. But you found the courage to speak anyway. And in doing so, you reminded me, reminded all of us, why we do this work. Thank you for that gift. Thank you for your bravery. And thank you, Buddy, for showing us all what unconditional love and protection look like." The courtroom erupted in applause. Emma stood, tears streaming down her face, and Buddy stood with her, his tail wagging. They walked forward together to stand before one last time, and the judge descended from her bench, just as she had 5 years earlier, to kneel and embrace them both. "You changed everything," whispered in Emma's ear. "Never forget that. You and this remarkable dog changed everything." And she was right. Because on that spring day when an 8-year-old girl had given a hidden signal, and her golden retriever had responded with fierce protective love, something fundamental had shifted in the American justice system. Courtrooms across the nation began to understand that true justice required not just following the law, but recognizing the humanity of those the law was meant to serve. Emma grew up to become a lawyer specializing in children's rights, eventually arguing cases before the very judges who had studied her case in law school. Buddy lived to the remarkable age of 15, working by Emma's side until his final days, and when he passed, a bench was installed outside Judge's old courtroom with a plaque reading, "In memory of Buddy, who taught a courtroom about courage, compassion, and unconditional love." But the real legacy wasn't in plaques or laws or legal precedents. It was in the thousands of children who found the courage to speak because Emma had spoken first. It was in the therapy dogs who were welcomed into courtrooms because Buddy had shown the way. It was in the judges who learned to bend rules when compassion required it, who remembered that behind every case file was a human being deserving of dignity and protection. It was in the understanding that sometimes the most important signals are silent, that sometimes the best advocates have 4 legs and a wagging tail, and that sometimes justice requires having the wisdom to stop everything, to pause, to listen, and to recognize that the rules we make should serve the people who need them most. And it all started with a little girl, a hidden signal, and a judge who dared to believe that protecting one child mattered more than protecting a precedent. That was justice, that was healing, that was how the world changed, one brave moment at a time.